Right now, the United States is implementing the most aggressive sanctions regime in history against Cuba. And what most people do not realize is that this economic collapse won't stay contained on the island. These sanctions are creating a financial crisis that will trigger mass migration, destabilize the Caribbean economy, and could spark a banking crisis in Florida. The economic collapse has already begun. But before I reveal which U.S. banks are most exposed to Caribbean financial contagion and exactly what this means for your investments, let me show you the 3 economic shockwaves these Cuba sanctions are creating that nobody is discussing. Welcome to Financial History Decoded, where we break down how geopolitical decisions create financial crises you need to understand. On January 15, 2026, Marco Rubio became Secretary of State with one mission: use economic warfare to force regime change in Cuba. This isn't just foreign policy, this is economic policy that will have massive financial consequences. And the economic precedent they're using to justify this strategy, Venezuela sanctions, actually proves the opposite of what they claim. Let me show you the economics behind what's really happening. Here's a strategic economic logic. The Trump administration believes that maximum economic pressure, comprehensive sanctions cutting off all revenue, will force Cuba's government to collapse. They're pointing to Venezuela as proof this works. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. Delta Force captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Within weeks, Venezuela's political transition seemed to prove maximum pressure works. But here's what the economic data actually shows. Venezuela sanctions didn't cause regime change, military intervention did, and those sanctions created an economic disaster that actually strengthened America's adversaries. Let me break down the economics. When the United States sanctioned Venezuela's oil sector, Western oil companies were forced to exit. Chinese and Russian firms immediately acquired those assets. Venezuelan oil sales rerouted through Chinese and Russian buyers at discounted prices. The economic effect: U.S. companies lost market share, Chinese and Russian companies gained strategic oil assets. American economic leverage disappeared. A 2026 Atlantic Council economic analysis concluded that maximum pressure was a gift to China and Russia. The sanctions reduced Venezuelan oil production from 2.8 million barrels per day in 2013 to under 800,000 barrels per day by 2024. But this production collapse did unproduce regime change. It produced humanitarian catastrophe. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country. Healthcare systems collapsed. Widespread malnutrition, mass economic migration. But the regime survived until military force removed Maduro. So, the Venezuela economic precedent doesn't prove sanctions work. It proves sanctions create economic disasters without achieving their objectives unless you use military force. Now, the same strategy is being applied to Cuba. But Cuba's economy is fundamentally different from Venezuela in ways that make this even more economically dangerous. Cuba has been economically isolated from the United States for 67 years. The Cuban economy is already delinked from American markets. Additional sanctions don't represent a systemic economic shock. They represent incremental tightening of pressure that's already existed for decades. Venezuela had deep economic integration with the United States before sanctions. Cuba doesn't. This means the economic mechanisms that caused Venezuelan economic pain, cutting off access to U.S. financial systems, blocking dollar transactions, preventing oil sales to American buyers. Those mechanisms have limited additional impact on Cuba because Cuba already operates outside those systems. So what does maximum economic pressure on Cuba actually produce? The first economic shockwave is energy grid collapse. Cuba's electrical grid depends on imported fuel oil. Russia, Mexico, and Venezuela have historically supplied this oil. But Venezuela's collapse eliminated that supply line. Russian shipments have been inconsistent. Mexican supply is limited. The new U.S. sanctions target any entity providing oil to Cuba. This creates an economic calculation for potential suppliers. Sell oil to Cuba and lose access to U.S. financial systems and American markets. Or stop selling to Cuba and maintain U.S. economic relationships. For most companies and countries, That's not a difficult choice. The economic incentive structure overwhelmingly favors compliance with U.S. sanctions. So Cuba's fuel imports are collapsing. The economic consequence is electrical grid failure. During summer 2024, Havana experienced blackouts lasting up to 18 hours per day. Industrial production stopped, refrigeration failed, water pumping systems went offline. This wasn't temporary infrastructure maintenance. This was economic collapse from energy starvation. And the 2026 sanctions intensify this pressure. The second economic shockwave is currency collapse and hyperinflation. Cuba operates a dual currency system, the Cuban peso for domestic transactions and the convertible peso pegged to the US dollar for foreign exchange. But sanctions eliminate Cuba's ability to earn hard currency. Tourism revenue collapses when international financial systems can't process Cuban transactions. Remittances from Cuban Americans dry up when transfer mechanisms get sanctioned. Export earnings disappear when foreign buyers face secondary sanctions for purchasing Cuban goods. The economic result is a balance of payments crisis. Cuba can't earn the dollars needed to import food, medicine, fuel. The government prints Cuban pesos to cover domestic spending. But without hard currency backing, the peso collapses. Inflation accelerates. By late 2024, informal exchange rates showed the Cuban peso trading at 200 to 1 against the dollar on black markets, versus the official rate of 24 to 1. This represents currency collapse, and currency collapse means ordinary Cubans can afford food even when it's available because their savings have been economically destroyed by hyperinflation. The third economic shockwave is the one that directly impacts the United States. Mass economic migration, when economic conditions become catastrophic, when people can't feed their families, when electrical grids fail, when currency becomes worthless, they leave. Economic migrants don't wait for political permission. They build rafts, they pay smugglers, they risk everything because staying means certain economic death. During the 1990s special period when Soviet subsidies ended, Cuba experienced economic crises. GDP contracted 35%. Over 30,000 Cubans attempted ocean crossings to Florida in 1994 alone. Many died in the Florida Straits. The U.S. Coast Guard interdicted thousands. It created a migration crisis. Now, consider 2026 conditions. The economic pressure is more comprehensive than the 1990s. The electrical grid is failing. Food shortages are intensifying. Currency is collapsing. And there are 11 million people in Cuba. If even 5% attempt migration, that's 550,000 people heading toward Florida. The Coast Guard can't interdict numbers at that scale. Florida's infrastructure can't absorb sudden population influx. This is an abstract geopolitical theory. This is an economic and humanitarian disaster that lands directly in Marco Rubio's home state. Here's the economic irony. The Trump administration eliminated the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan parole program in 2026. This program provided legal pathways for managed migration, eliminating legal pathways while simultaneously intensifying. Economic conditions that create migration pressure is economically and logically contradictory. You can't close the safety valve while increasing the pressure and expect the system not to explode. The economic incentive structure guarantees increased irregular migration. People facing economic catastrophe will attempt ocean crossings, regardless of interdiction risk, because the perceived economic risk of staying exceeds the perceived risk of crossing. This is basic economic decision-making under duress. Now let's talk about the financial system implications that nobody is discussing. Florida's banking system has significant exposure to Caribbean economic stability. Regional banks in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Tampa have loan portfolios that include remittance services, small business lending to Cuban American-owned businesses, and investments in Caribbean financial instruments. A sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of economic migrants creates immediate strain. Remittance flows that previously generated fee income disappear as migrants can't support families back home. Small businesses serving immigrant communities face demand shocks. Real estate markets in South Florida experience pressure from sudden population increases. This isn't catastrophic systemic risk to major banks. But for regional banks with concentrated Caribbean exposure, this represents measurable financial stress. And we learned in 2023 with Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic that regional bank stress can cascade quickly when depositors lose confidence. There's an even darker economic scenario. What if rapid regime collapse produces not orderly democratic transition, but economic state failure? What happens when Cuba becomes a failed state, 90 miles from Florida? Haiti provides the economic precedent. Haiti's state failure created an ungoverned economy where gangs control Port-au-Prince, where legitimate commerce has collapsed, where the formal economy has been replaced by criminal enterprise. Cuba sits astride major drug trafficking routes between South American cocaine production and North American consumption markets. Cuban geography makes the island strategically valuable for transshipment. Currently, Cuban law enforcement maintains counter-narcotics cooperation, preventing cartel use of Cuban territory. But state collapse eliminates that cooperation. If the Cuban government falls rapidly, if the security apparatus dissolves, if economic institutions fail, Mexican and Colombian cartels will exploit the power vacuum. Former Cuban security personnel, trained in intelligence and coercion, become available for cartel recruitment. Ungoverned Cuban ports and airstrips become trafficking infrastructure. Suddenly, the United States faces a drug trafficking surge originating 90 miles offshore with no Cuban government to partner with for interdiction. Let me show you the financial market implications. Increased Caribbean instability affects cruise line stocks. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian cruise lines all have significant Caribbean route exposure. Economic crisis and potential state failure in Cuba create security risks that reduce cruise bookings. These are publicly traded companies with billions in market capitalization. Tourism revenue collapse in the broader Caribbean affects regional economies that depend on American tourists. Economic contagion spreads. Florida real estate markets face uncertainty from migration, surges, and potential security deterioration. Insurance costs increase. All of this creates measurable economic impact that shows up in corporate earnings, municipal budgets, and financial markets. Now let's examine whether this economic strategy even works based on historical evidence. Academic research on sanctions effectiveness is clear. Comprehensive economic sanctions rarely achieve regime change objectives. A 2014 European Journal of Political Research study found that sanctions strengthen authoritarian regimes when the regime possesses strong nationalist legitimacy and limited economic integration with the sanctioning power. Cuba checks both boxes. The Castro government has substantial legitimacy, rooted in nationalist mythology, about resisting U.S. intervention. The Bay of Pigs invasion, multiple assassination attempts, 67 years of embargo. All of this creates nationalist narrative that external economic pressure is imperialist aggression. And Cuba's economy has been substantially delinked from the United States for 6 decades, meaning additional sanctions impose costs but don't represent systemic economic shocks that force capitulation. Look at the economic case studies. South Africa's apartheid ended partly due to sanctions. But South Africa had deep Western economic integration, making sanctions devastating. South Africa faced unified international pressure, including from traditional allies. And South Africa had contested domestic legitimacy with organized internal opposition. Cuba has none of these characteristics. Iraq sanctions from 1992-2003 killed hundreds of thousands through humanitarian deprivation, but Saddam Hussein stayed in power until military invasion. North Korea has faced comprehensive sanctions for 6 decades with near-total economic isolation, and the regime has not collapsed. If maximum economic pressure could force North Korean regime change despite conditions far more extreme than Cuba currently faces, what evidence suggests it will work in Havana? Here's what the economic evidence actually shows. Sanctions often serve authoritarian leaders' political interests by allowing them to externalize responsibility for economic failure. Regime officials blame external enemies, the United States, imperialism, rather than internal mismanagement for economic problems. This is economically and politically convenient. When the electrical grid fails, the government blames U.S. sanctions, not infrastructure. When food shortages intensify, they blame the embargo, not agricultural mismanagement. Economic pressure can actually entrench authoritarian rule by providing convenient scape. So we have three possible economic scenarios. Scenario 1, muddle through. Russia, China, and Mexico provide minimal oil supply sufficient to prevent total grid collapse. Cuba survives in a state of permanent economic crisis, but doesn't collapse. The regime endures through repression and limited reforms. Trump eventually claims victory through some minor concessions and suspends tariffs. Scenario 2, economic catastrophe and mass migration. Fuel supplies collapse completely. Economic conditions become unbearable. Hundreds of thousands attempt ocean crossings to Florida. The United States faces simultaneous humanitarian crises and political backlash. Eventually, pressure forces policy reversal. Scenario 3, state failure. Rapid regime collapse creates power vacuum. Security apparatus dissolves. Criminal organizations exploit ungoverned territory. Cuba becomes a failed state requiring potential U.S. military intervention to prevent cartel territorial control 90 miles from Florida. The economic data suggests scenario 1 is most likely because authoritarian regimes can sustain extraordinary economic hardship if security forces remain loyal and populations lack alternatives. Cuba survived the 1990s special period when GDP contracted 35%. North Korea sustained totalitarianism through 6 decades of comprehensive pressure. But scenario 2 is also quite possible because this is the most intense economic pressure Cuba has faced since the 1990s, and the migration push factors are enormous. Scenario 3 is low probability but catastrophically high impact if it occurs. Here's what this means for you economically. If you have investments in Florida, real estate, Caribbean tourism, regional banking, or industries exposed to migration shocks, understand that policy decisions in Washington are creating economic risks that will materialize over the next 12 to 18 months. This isn't abstract geopolitics. This is economic policy that produces measurable financial consequences. If you're in financial services in South Florida, prepare for potential stress in remittance flows and loan portfolios with Caribbean exposure. If you're in tourism or hospitality industries, watch Caribbean stability indicators because economic crisis reduces tourist bookings. This is the economic reality of using sanctions as weapons. The bottom line is this. The United States is betting that comprehensive economic pressure can achieve what 67 years of embargo could not. Regime change in Cuba through economic coercion alone. The empirical evidence suggests overwhelming skepticism. The economic logic reveals multiple constraints. The humanitarian and economic cost is already materializing, but genuine uncertainty remains about which pathway Cuba takes from here. What we do know is that economic warfare produces economic consequences, and those consequences won't stay contained on the island. Subscribe for updates as this economic crisis unfolds. Share this with someone who needs to understand the financial implications. Drop a comment with your thoughts on whether economic sanctions actually work. The economic experiment is happening right now. Stay informed about how it affects your money. I'll see you in the next video.